Hey everybody, I'm Mad Max of Maxwell Manor, and as you might hear, I have the flu. Oh shit, I need to drink some Tussin. Back shortly. There we go. Get some Tussin in me. I also have my last bit of Dayquil. See if I can open this without cutting myself. Ugh, this knife is the drizzling shits. Anyway, I have the flu. It hit me yesterday like a ton of bricks, and it is retreating about as fast as it came because I am shoving all kinds of over-the-counter drugs in my mouth. From Dayquil to NyQuil to Benadryl to cough drops. I'm doing it all. And it is working because the second a cold or a flu hits my lungs, I go completely ham about taking it out. So, yeah. I'll be drinking a lot of NyQuil tonight, tell you that. I need a cough drop. I try not to let my fingers touch those sticky bastard things. Hate them. Anyway, so our videos. What have we got today? Well, as you can see, we've got a bunch of Wendigo stuff. Every political ideology explained, the religious and cult iceberg explained, a bunch of psychopath stuff. Really fun.
Basic roadmap. Hello everybody, today we are going to be looking over every single political ideology, and yes, I mean...
So, the reason I chose this one is somebody was nice enough to timestamp all of them. And he was accurate in what I say minarchism is. Because ever since I learned what minarchism was in 10th grade civics class, I have been a minarchist.
all of them. And the way we are going to do that is with a little thing called the political compass. I'm going to go ahead and explain how that political compass works. However, if you're already familiar with it, just letting you know now that there's timestamps to each quadrant of the compass in the description. Also, do you all like that I have a new board and an actual light source now? We're really moving up in the world. The political compass is a roadmap that is used to determine how one ideology relates to another. And it basically works like this. The higher up on the compass the ideology is, the more authoritarian or pro-government it is. And the lower something is on the compass, the more libertarian or anti-government it is. So if whatever ideology you're looking at is somewhere north of this axis, it's most likely in favor of large government. Whereas if what you're looking at is south of the axis, it's probably more freedom or individual oriented. And then your left to right or x-axis determines how that ideology handles money and social issues. For example, if your ideology is on the left side of the compass, it probably has ideas that are more socially centered. Or in other words, more ideas that money should be redistributed to people and that people should overall be more accepting of others. Whereas if your ideology is on the right side of compass, they probably value privacy more and the idea that someone maintains their own wealth. Now, I'm being very general right now, and as we start going through specific ideologies, you'll probably see it better in practice. However, as you can already see, this is where ideas like right-wing or left-wing come from. So just for an example, say that whatever ideology we're talking about is very anti-government and thinks that people should share their money. They are going to be down in this quadrant somewhere. Now let's say your ideology is very pro-government and thinks that someone should keep whatever money they make. That ideology is going to be somewhere up here. So while not perfect, this is a good way of determining how certain ideas or philosophies compare to each other. Now, as people who are familiar with it know, the compass does have some downsides, and it's not a perfect way of determining what someone believes. For example, one of the things that we're going to see as we get into the compass is ideas around ethnicity. Like, for example, if someone believes that their ethnicity is the best and others shouldn't interact with them, that's going to show up more on the right. And that's simply because ideas on the right are more about being exclusionary or maintaining your own privacy as you see it, whereas the left is more about living together and community-centered ideas. That doesn't mean someone on the right is racist. That doesn't mean someone on the left isn't racist. That's just the trend that you see. But
by the way, I'm probably not going to do as much reacting to this as all that, simply because I am sick and his voice is very soothing to have on in the background. But if you would like to comment, feel free to do so. I've got the TTS turned on as always.
For example, let's
also, comment in the YouTube comments, obviously, if you're watching this later.
Say that we take someone and their only two ideas is that they're very, very racist and they think everyone should share their money. Well, that is a very right-wing ideology combined with a very left-wing ideology. So on the compass, they're going to end up somewhere around here. Now, let's say alternatively, you have someone else who thinks all races should get along and isn't racist at all, but thinks that everyone should keep their own money and give none of it away. Well, that is, again, a very left-wing ideology combined with a very right-wing ideology, so that idea is also going to end up here. Even though these two people disagree on literally everything, they show up on the same spot on the compass, and that's why this isn't a perfect way of determining what someone believes.
So what we're doing in Final Fantasy XIV is we're getting to the Golden Saucer as fast as possible, because at 7 o'clock we get the draw. The fucking lucky number draw, and I want to get my numbers in before that.
That's where jokes come in. Like, if you have someone who doesn't believe in anything, they technically wind up on the center. But if you also have someone who believes in everything very hard from all the corners at once, they would also wind up on the center. So just because two ideologies are laying next to each other whenever we go through them, that doesn't mean they're close in belief. That just means the rule of averages kind of ended up putting them next to each other. And also, I want to say this now, we're literally going to go over 100 ideologies from history. These are a vast array of ideas and concepts that have been tried or theorized.
You ain't fucking kidding there.
Don't apply modern politics to what I'm going to talk about, because it's not going to work. Like, to put it into perspective, the entirety of modern US politics takes place in about that circle. Now, that doesn't mean people who are parts of US politics or US government can't be from other places on the compass, but the actual policies and sort of practices in the US are just that little circle. This is much, much bigger.
Oh yeah, this was August 19th, 2021. So, context.
Than modern buzzwords or media stories. Also, I'm going to number these quadrants as 1, 2, 3, 4 because that's just the way it works in math. So as we go through this, don't try to apply modern buzzwords or politics to these ideas or places on the compass, because it's not really going to work. For example, if you come in saying that gun control is a left-wing thing, well, I've got news for you. Gun control is an
authoritarian
top of the compass thing. Because historically and in practice, the only people that have believed that guns should be taken away is people who think that they should be in charge of what happens.
Yeah.
And then people further down on the compass who advocate for it normally do it as a sort of social policy. However, the only ones that maintain it throughout history are those who want power. Or take an issue like abortion, and you may say that's a left-wing thing. Well, again, it's an entire bottom of the compass thing. The reason being, people at the bottom of the compass who don't like government control think that people should be entitled to their own actions and their own agency, and therefore should be allowed to get an abortion. And in the opposite direction as gun control, if people further up on the compass are convinced to not do it, it's normally from an ethics standpoint. So as we talk about politics and different forms of government, and I use a lot of words like conservative and liberal, you've got to separate that from preconceived notions in today's media, because I guarantee you those words do not mean what the modern news and formats say that they mean. We are going to go through this image here, which was sent in to me by a fan. I have lost the email and cannot find who did it, But if you're watching this, please leave a comment below because I appreciate the idea. As you can see, there's some ideologies that are off of the compass, and that's because they're so wacky or over the top that they don't really fit on the compass and kind of work as a parody of the quadrant itself. And because of the whole right-wing, left-wing, authoritarian, libertarian thing, the quadrants can be described as authoritarian right, authoritarian left, libertarian left, and libertarian right. We are going to go through these in the numbers I mentioned earlier, again, just because that's how it works in math. And hopefully you enjoy it as we go through the whole of human ideology and politics to talk about all ideas as they range from authoritarian to libertarian, from socialist to capitalist.
I'm gonna see. I want to see if anybody in my Discord will play ball. So I'm reacting to this. Well, I say I am, but I'm sick, so less so. Which are you all at? I've been a minarchist since 10th grade. I learned what it was. Christ almighty, excuse me. This video perfectly encapsulates it. So, theory, it should do as good a job with all the other ideologies. Paste. Oh, Corgi. Yeah, 2 other people are blind on input on accessibility, but they're just mostly screen readers, so. Yeah, that's a kettle of fish. Well outside of my knowledge. I'm sure it can be done. I just don't know enough about screen readers to give any ideas on how, except anything's better than OCR. My dream is to someday help make a complex game fully blind accessible. Got an entire forum free for the honorary tattoo, but not CDDA. That is quite something else entirely. It's got to be the right game from the right dev team at the right time with the right infrastructure to build off of. But I'm convinced we'll find it eventually. Until then, show off games as they are, and let the people judge as they will, and help the devs as much as my idea brain can. Short and gotta pick my battles. What the fuck? There we go.
And speaking of capitalist, have you ever thought making your own content or editing videos, but you're not exactly sure what editor to use? Well, let me introduce you to today's sponsor, Wondershare Filmora. Wondershare Filmora is great if you're just starting out or a Caesar's deal. Like you can text, still load Wondershare, Filmora Watermora is, or Filmora in a video. Thank you so much. A deeper dive shirt, which I'm very thankful to Kiana Bebop, who I will tag in the description when I talk about the shirts, a Twitter artist who did the design for me. It means a lot. As you can see, it's based on the deeper dive or conspiracy episodes, and on the back it says, "Ask me about giants," because if there's one thing I love on this channel, it's giants. So link to that will be in the description. Thank you all so much for the support you've shown me. It really does mean a lot. I'm at like 550,000 subs now, and it's still wild that this little hobby of mine turned into what it is, and all of you great people, and I'm really blessed and just thankful for the opportunity. So we're going to go ahead and get into it. I hope you enjoy, but above all else, and I mean it, thank you for watching. So we are beginning with the top right corner, also known as authoritarian right. I also want to emphasize that I am not a technical historian or political expert, although I pretend to be one on the internet. So I guarantee you that you probably know more than I do. I'm just doing this for fun. So please be easy on me. I promise I'm trying my best. We're going to start as close to the center as possible with these ideologies and then get to the weirder and wacky ones as we move on. So first up, we have third way. Third way is pretty much as close to the dead center as you can get. It's the idea that we can have stuff like right-wing capitalism, where people can keep their money, and then left-wing social policies like social programs and things like that. The true concept of third way was something that came around while Bill Clinton was in presidency, and it's
Sounds like a good idea that'll never ever be implemented here.
It's pretty much just a central balance of all of it. Just to the right of that, we have national liberalism. Now, as I mentioned earlier, right side of the compass, and the closer you get to the right side, is the more that you focus on either yourself or your own country. National liberalism is pretty much third way, only those healthcare policies and things apply to your own nation. In other words, you're not doing aid programs for other people, just your own. So while still moderate, it's slightly right of third way because it's slightly more self-focused. Just above that is senatorialism. This is pretty much the idea that a country should be run by a senate or a small group of elected people. As you move further down the compass, there's sort of this dissolving of power, and as you move up, there's more of a focus of power. So the very top is one person or one very small group of people should run everything, and at the bottom is a very large or no one should run everything. So the reason senatorialism is a little bit up is because it's a relatively small group of people. However, it's not crazy or anything because these people are either chosen or there's enough of them that they can be trusted. Pretty similar to the idea of how Rome's government worked. And to the right of that is constitutional monarchism. This is the idea that you can have something like a king or a queen, but they're bound to a very specific set of rules. The easiest way to define it is that the king or queen does not rule over their people, they simply reign over their people. What that means is there is a very limited amount of things that they can do, and it serves as more of a presidency or elected office. However, because it's a monarch and kind of gives idea to the whole birthright idea of a leadership, it's still a relatively right-wing ideology. Because as we get more to the right, we're going to see more value given to worth at birth. And just to the right of that, we have liberalism. This is where that thing I said earlier about don't try to assign modern buzzwords to this compass apply. Because in most modern contexts, liberalism is defined as like a leftist ideology, when in actuality, it's comparatively right. The core tenet of liberalism is essentially government-protected individuality. Or in other words, everyone has equality, and the government's purpose is to make sure that people maintain their own agency. Or in other words, police should protect you from people that do crimes, everyone's allowed to vote, etc. Again, that doesn't mean other places on the compass or even in other quadrants don't also feel that way. That's just the main ideas of liberalism, and the reason it's sort of a right policy is because it believes in hardcore individuality. And you know, the state's supposed to protect it, so that's what puts it up here in the authoritarian right. Jumping back over here, we have progressive conservatism. The core idea of progressive conservatism was mostly put together as a response to slavery in the 1800s. The idea is you still have a conservative government that holds on to pre-existing values. However, there is forceful progress in certain directions. Basically, as it was done with slavery, is the government comes in and forces people to quit doing that. And because there is an
was like,
element
"You,
of government force,
stop."
that's what pushes it further up on the compass. However, since it's progressive, it's naturally more left than normal conservatism, which we'll get to in a second. And just right of that, we have eco-conservatism. Eco-conservatism,
Ugh.
also known as green conservatism, is again a government that protects what is already there, but directly applied to nature. So this is where things like Teddy Roosevelt and the Federal Parks Program comes into play. And in practice, it needs a semi-strong government as a means of protecting those ecological areas. Now you may be confused thinking that eco stuff or stuff to do with nature is more of a left-wing idea, and as we're going to see later, it's also a left-wing idea, but because the upper right is so concerned with preserving what already exists and keeping things sacred, preserving nature also applies to them as well. And because you need, again, a semi-strong government to actually mandate this, that's what pushes it up. And just above those is Kuomintangism. Probably
Right?
not pronouncing that right. This is essentially a party within Taiwan that believes Taiwan should be combined with China. And while on an
Ugh.
economic or social axis, they're pretty center. The fact that they want to join to a very powerful centralized government makes the ideology pretty close to authoritarian, but not quite. And then just to the right of that, we have confederalism. You may be familiar with the word Confederate because of the Confederate Army during the American Civil War. However, you may not know what the term actually means. Confederalism, or a confederacy, is basically the idea that the small states or sectioned off groups of people are much, much stronger than the actual government that connects them all. Contrast that with something like how the United States works, where the state cannot overrule what the federal government says. Confederacy is basically the other way around. Now, as we're going to see in a bit, this can go either way. It can either mean you have a very strong state that enforces people what to do, or as we'll see later, it can mean you have states that allow much more freedom than a federal government could. But because it allows for more power to potentially take place, and also in a lot of practice confederacy, states have very strong borders, or in other words, a very militarized government, that's what pushes it near the top over here. Just to the right of that is elective monarchism. This is a monarchy, or in other words, a king or queen. However, they are elected in most often cases by a small group of people. The reason this is higher and more to the right than a constitutional monarchy is because, again, normally a small group of people elect whoever the king or queen is, and most often they have more power than in a constitutional monarchy. An example of this that a lot of people don't really think about is Vatican City, because technically the Pope is elected by a small group of the cardinals. And the reason it's sort of dead center of the authoritarian right is because it can go either way depending on if the king or queen is good or bad, or very overwhelming or very liberating of their people. And then jumping back down here, we have conservatism. The basic tenet of conservatism is to conserve what already exists. So things like religious rights and property ownership are important to an average conservative, and therefore a government is needed to protect those certain rights. This is something that we're going to see a lot more of whenever we get to the libertarian right later in the video, but the right side has a lot of focus on individuality and personal ownership. Whereas more left-leaning ideas, even as you can see here in the difference between liberalism and conservatism, revolve around the idea of sharing the wealth and providing for your own people. This is also what I meant earlier whenever I circled this general area and said the majority of American politics occur here. This is what I'm talking about. Liberal conservatism, which is right above conservatism, isn't necessarily a combination between the two, but more of its own thing. Liberal conservatism is those conservative tenets that I talked about earlier. However, there is more of a push towards law and order and forced good. In other words, the basic idea that people should not only be corrected in a physical law sense, but also in a morality sense. In other words, things that go against core conservative tenets or practices should at least be frowned upon.
Reminds me of the fucking 80s.
Literally using your conservatism. I hope that wasn't too confusing. I promise I'm trying my best. Basically, the government can be used to sort of guide people down certain ideologies, which is why it's more north than basic liberalism or conservatism. And then just above that, we have national conservatism. This is basically the idea of preserving one's own value, but specifically applied to your country. In other words, a taught and felt sense of importance when it comes to world issues, and an overall sense of national pride. because that naturally involves the use of more government, or at least a sense of betterment when it comes to government, that's what pushes it up. Even though economy can vary, it's normally along the lines of what we do is right because we're right. I also need to get this out of the way now. If I make jokes about something as we go through this, it's not me showing favoritism or disdain for a certain ideology. It's just because I like to make jokes, and I'm going to do it whenever I can. And then right beneath that, and next to liberal conservatism, we have Zionism. Zionism is specifically applied to the Jewish people.
Like a vault.
That they are entitled to the nation of Israel. And while not really that authoritarian, it is pretty right-wing because it falls back into that whole sense of national identity.
All that Talmud
and
shit.
Purpose at birth. And then all the way with our first one on the right wall of the compass is fiscal conservatism. Fiscal conservatism is conservatism, the idea that you should preserve what you have, applied specifically to money. And since the closer you get to the right, the more the ideology likes to keep their
I'm
money.
fiscally
And the idea of
conservative.
fiscal conservatism being that the government exists to protect your own money. You get the point. While not overly authoritarian, it's the idea that when it comes to money, you should be able to keep whatever you make, and the government should exist to protect that wealth. And then right above that one, we have neoconservatism. This is a new idea, new, get it, that really spawned in the United States around the time of Vietnam. And it's essentially the idea that we should share these conservative principles of what matters to us with everyone else. Or in other words, it's the concept of interventionism. The idea that
I'm not a
these
fan of
beliefs and policies
interventionism.
that work for us, therefore we should share, or in some cases force that with other people.
Exactly
and
that.
again, since the right also is the idea of our way of life is important, the idea of rapidly enforcing your way of life on other people is very, very right-wing. And then right above that is traditional conservatism. I promise I'm going to stop saying the word conservatism here in a second. So like with all the other ones, how they're all different routes that conservatism can take, this one's specifically about morality. Or in other words, the preserved or kept ideas of what is good and what is wrong should be enforced on other people. That's the reason that this one's even further up on the authoritarian axis, because while a lot can keep in mind the idea of the state mandating stuff like money, the idea of them mandating things like morality is a lot more on the pro-government side. Ideas like this are seen with a lot of religious organizations, and the idea that because we do things a certain way, you should also do things that certain way. Even though the two are pretty close together, paleoconservatism is almost the opposite of neoconservatism. Whereas neo believes we should share our doctrines with the rest of the world, paleoconservatism is the idea that we should be kept to ourselves and not interact with the outside world as much as possible, or at least in the sense of policy and military. Also, core tenets with paleoconservatism is the idea, or at least as it's applied in the United States nowadays, that we have gone too far, or at least the military has gone too far. And while you may think, oh, not putting your military into other nations, that sounds like a very far removed policy from all these others, but you have to realize that also applies to international aid. So if another country needs help, the paleoconservative idea is don't give it to them because we don't want to talk to them as much as possible. And then to the right of that, we have Pinochetism. This is named after the General Pinochet of Chile, or Chile, whatever. So it's pretty much a doctrine based around his practices. And for those that don't know, Pinochet was famous for taking socialists within Chile, taking them up in the air in a helicopter, and then throwing them out. So it's not only conservative ideas of we have to maintain what's important to us, it's the idea of actively and very quickly removing those who do not agree with you. So yeah, you can't get much more maintaining your values than immediately killing anyone that doesn't maintain those values. Moving back over here more towards the left and a little bit up, we have Christian theocracy. This is the idea that there should be a government of some sort that sole purpose is to maintain Christian values. So while like economically, because Christians believe in helping the poor and things like that, it's kind of diverse, or at least center when it comes to money. The reason it's so authoritarian is because it's a specific way of thinking, that way of thinking being Christianity, and the idea that the government needs to mandate it in some way. And to go ahead and speed this up a bit, Hindu theocracy, Buddhist theocracy, and Islamist theocracy are all the exact same thing, only applied to those respective religions. So pretty much with all of these, Christian included, it's the idea of taking the values from that specific religion and having a state that's sole purpose is to enforce those ideas. So as you can imagine, pretty authoritarian, since it's the government whose sole purpose is to force religion on others. And then to the right of all of those, we have feudalism. Most easily explained, feudalism is a land-based class structure. This is something that was commonly seen in medieval Europe, and is basically the idea that you have a lord who owns the land, you have the knights and sort of soldier class that work as his private guard, and then the peasants that just live on the land. This is a very clear hierarchy with a very clear power structure, and basically holds the idea that the amount of worth that someone has within an economy or social structure is solely defined by the amount of property that they own. And then just above feudalism, you have colonialism. Now, colonialism is often used as a sort of insult to groups of people who move to a new area and then begin to live there, and that's not what this is talking about. True colonialism is the idea that you can go to a new area, simply farm all of its resources and collect the profit from it. Or in other words, this is like a cartoon level of capitalism, like Dude from the Lorax level capitalism. Basically the idea that if you find a resource that you can use to make a profit, you are entitled to it. And therefore in a government structure, you either are the reigning government or the reigning government protects those rights. And then just left of that, we have aristocracy. The main principle of an aristocracy is there are some people who are just better at ruling and making decisions than others. So therefore a privileged few control what everyone else is allowed to do. A lot of older governments ruled like this, and the only thing that separates it from being at the very top is you technically have some dispersion of government, because instead of just having one king or queen who controls what everyone does all the time, it's a few people who control what everyone does all the time. So, you know, some level of balance, but it's essentially in line with the some people are just better than others argument. And now we're getting up there with the wacky ones, starting with neo-fascism. Neo-fascism, or basically new fascism, was created immediately after World War II. And it's basically the idea that core tenets of fascist governments should be preserved. We'll get into what those core tenets are here in a second, but the main ideas behind neo-fascism is fascism worth depending on their ethnicity. National pride is very important and should be enforced and used. And ideas like a very strong military and an emphasized importance on preserved tradition. Over here on the left, we have something known as Vichy fascism. This is specifically in reference to certain French groups that allied themselves with Italy and Germany during World War II. So in other words, it's basically fascism, although instead of just national importance, there is some level of other country importance, or alliance at least. So it's not totally isolationist, but it's still fascism, which makes it still very super authoritarian. And then for our first one, at the roof of the political compass, we have fascism. Fascism is essentially a form of extreme nationalism. It's the idea that people native to a certain country are the most important within that country, and things like self-control and agency should be sacrificed for the greater good of one's own people. This is most often done through a very strong military that enforces standards or moral practices. And the reason it's not super right-wing, even though it has ideas like intense nationalism within it, is because within fascism itself, there is a lot of sort of social programs for, of course, the people that fascism favors. So while there are several sort of socialist elements to the privileged class within a country, those don't apply to the people that it doesn't want it to apply to. Basically, it's the idea of standing up for your own people and helping yourself, and doing that by stepping on everyone else. And then just to the right of that, we have esoteric fascism. This is everything that I just said, with more of a focus on the spiritual or supernatural. And a lot of the ideas within it justify the whole ethnic pride thing through a sense of spiritual superiority. Or in other words, we're not just better because we were born better, we're better because we've always been destined to be better. And then to the right of that, we have the big spooky one, Nazism, which is in itself a form of fascism.
Spooky one.
The reason Nazism is to the right of fascism is because, as it's been historically proven, Nazism is much more active with its beliefs. Whereas fascism, maybe we shouldn't encourage outsiders to come in or help people that aren't us. Nazism is actively removing those outsiders, which is not only super authoritarian, but more of a direct action approach when it comes to these ideas. The reason it's not all the way on the right is because, similar to fascism that I mentioned earlier, there is a spreading of wealth within one's own country. Nazism itself is short for National Socialism. So while economically it's not over there, when it comes to things like social or order of importance, it's pretty much as far right as one can get. And then just to the right of that is neo-Nazism. I'll be honest, and this doesn't just apply to this one, but applies to a lot on the compass. I'm not entirely sure why the idea was placed where it's at. And I'm not an expert, so I'm not questioning it. I'm sure that this was done by someone far more educated than myself. But neo-Nazism in practice is pretty much just an attempt to bring back the core tenets of Nazism. So if I had to guess, the reason it's more right is because it's not only keeping up with the government that's currently in place, it's trying to institute a new government that has those beliefs. So you could kind of see that as more active. But yeah, in itself, the ideology is pretty much just trying to bring back the good old super racist, kill everyone ideas of Nazism. Coming off of the super hardcore dystopian governments a little bit, we have authoritarian capitalism. This is essentially the idea that power or control within a country should be based on who has the most money. And the super powerful super government that would exist in this realm, which is controlled by those capitalists, enforce not only a protection of their own wealth, but the class structure of the beneficiary and the worker. While this causes a huge disparity of wealth and power, there is a large focus in the ideology that those at the top have to maintain a level of material comfort for those under them. So essentially the idea that large corporations maintain money and they convince people it's not a problem because they give them cool stuff. And then just above that, we have corporate autocracy. This is essentially a full-blown totalitarian government, only instead of one person or a small group of people
It's fucking cyberpunk.
running it, it is only corporations. So what could possibly go wrong? And by ruling, I mean that judges and militaries and police and everything are specifically owned by corporations. It's pretty much like a dystopian sci-fi level of control that certain businesses would have, like something out of Borderlands. And again, harkens back to the ideas in authoritarian capitalism that those that have the most money should be the ones in charge. And then to the right of those two, we have imperialism. The easiest way to describe this in contrast to colonialism is imperialism is like colonialism in the fact that you find a new area and you take their resources. Only in imperialism, you stay there and make them do your way of life. So this is interventionism to the next level. It's not just the idea of we should help or stick our feet in where we can. It's the idea of we should go there, we should take their resources, we should make them think the way that we think and never leave. The most common example people use is Japan right before and during World War II and their behavior when it came to countries like China. And as you can imagine, imperial countries have a very strong military as a means of carrying out these imperialistic ideas. And then above imperialism, you have conquestalism. So again, climbing up the chain from colonialism to imperialism, conquestalism is you do the imperialism thing and then you keep going and you never stop and you go forever. It's essentially the idea that one's country or worth is defined by the land and resources that they can conquer. This is what a lot of really old empires would do, where they would just keep grabbing land and didn't really stop, and pretty much follows the idea that everyone has a right to everything if they'll take it. And not in the super standalone capitalist idea, which is something we'll see later on in the compass, but more so in the idea of a very powerful government being right and having the right to whatever they want. And then finally, in the top right corner, we have absolute monarchism. This is like the comedic level of a king or queen's power. It says that one person by divine right, or in other words, they were born into the role, has the ability to do whatever they want with their people whenever they want it. You cannot get more pro-ethnic worth or more pro-government than having one person who was born into the role decide what everyone does all the time with no limits. And also because religion is most commonly a right-wing.
So what we're going to do in Final Fantasy is do all the main story quest stuff right up until we get our mount and our ability to get seals and such. Because to do all of our crap, all of our hunting logs, we need our mount to be able to zippity zoop on through. So, yeah.
Ideology, the fact that absolute monarchs are normally justified as God-given worth or God-given right falls in line with this. It's the preservation of one person's thoughts and ideas being able to act however they want, which is, as you can see, the extremity of all right or authoritarian ideas that we've covered up until this point. So now that we've covered the entire authoritarian right corner of the political compass, let's go over the joke or wacky ones that are off of the compass. The first wacky ideology, which we can see off the right side of the compass, is social Darwinism. So you know how so far we've kind of seen the reoccurring thing that certain people or certain groups around this part think that some people are just better than others? Well, social Darwinism is the idea that the weakest in a species will die out over time. So on the political compass, it's saying that that's a good thing. Or in other words, people that have this perspective think that a government or people should be accustomed to the idea that if someone can't survive or can't make it, well, they're just supposed to die, and that means the rest of us get stronger. So sucks for them. Then up near the right top, we have Fordism, which is named after Henry Ford.
Oh, hi, buddy. Yeah, I'll shut the window. Don't need to deal with that shit. There you go, buddy. Yes, you're a good boy. Oh, yes. You taking care of me, huh? Yeah, you taking care of me? You're such a good boy taking care of me when I'm sick. Yeah. You're a good boy. You're a good boy. You're a good boy. Yes, you would. It's always nice to see Chip laying down on my bed.
Ford. And earlier, whenever I made the joke about cartoon level capitalism, Fordism is unironically cartoon capitalism. It's the idea that it's best if there are mass assembly lines and a system of government in which consumers are urged to buy products that are put together by a small group of workers, and it all goes into a big money machine that makes the corporation or corporate people richer. This is very similar to how coal mines were ran in the South around the 1950s. Basically, you have workers that work very hard all day, and then they are paid with money that can only be spent at the company store on goods. So therefore, you have these big bosses who made up fake money that they give to people who turn them over a profit, and they profit while other people suffer. This is saying that that's a good thing. And then above that is Genghis Khanism, which is named after conquestor Genghis Khan. If you don't know, he basically ran through the area that's now Mongol and China and pillaged and took whatever he wanted from everyone.
The joke ones are great.
Imperialism and conquestalism on steroids. Like, to the point, he never really did anything besides conquering. And also, it's believed that up to 2% of the world's population are direct descendants of Genghis Khan, because when he took whatever he wanted, that included women. So Genghis Khanism is you can take anything you want whenever you want, and that means anything. And then all the way off the top right corner of the compass, there's craterocracy. There we go. Craterocracy quite literally means the strong rule. And by strong, I mean like bulk, like physically strong. It's the idea that those who are powerful enough to fight and kill their way to the top of the government deserve that spot in government, and that if you have a small sort of oligarchy that is made out of super strong blood hunters, then that will therefore make your nation stronger. So quite literally, kill or be killed to take the throne, but not in a metaphorical sense. In a very literal, you have to kill the guy sitting in the chair.
Hey Tyler, how you been?
So it can most easily be described as a...
Yeah, sorry about that. I needed to rebrand. After 20 years, having a fucking prison nickname is kind of cringe.
based oligarchy. There's also one over here that is at the top, but because it also crosses its way over into authoritarian left, I don't want to talk about it yet. However, after the end of this next section, we'll go into detail about what that means. But for now, this is the entirety
Tyler Hoot,
of
good
the
to see that you are still doing pretty
authoritarian
good.
right side of the compass. So I'm going to
Tyler
change
Hoot, how are you
shirts
doing?
and be right back.
So I'm going to change shirts. I've been doing pretty good. How much did I weigh the last time you talked to me? Do you remember? Like even a ballpark.
Tyler Hoot, no.
Okay. Well, back in May, I weighed 300 pounds. When we moved up here in 2016, I weighed 383 pounds. I weighed 212 pounds. And I'm still losing weight.
Tyler Hoot, also I changed jobs, tongue sticking out.
Oh, what are you up to now, man? So, I've lost a shit ton of weight. My stomach has shrunk to just unbelievably small amounts, smaller than I ever thought. I exercise every day, and I still look as fat as ever.
Tyler Hoot, and super happy /
Thanks. And, other than that, nothing's really changed. I had to retire back in December because I thought that, I thought Chip was going to have me dragging him out every fucking hour of the day for a while there. But it turns out I can run when I don't have the flu. Who knew? Certainly not me. Certainly not me, who was told by the doctors for years and years and years that I'd never be able to run and that I
Tyler
should
Hoot,
never
LOL.
run. But, I mean, I can only do it for 15 seconds at a whack, but I can still do it, and it gets Chip all excited and gets him all running around, playing, and tiring him out. So, yeah, turns out this useless-ass body might not be as useless as I thought it was. So, that's nice. But at the same time, it kind of pisses me off, because I could have done all this
Tyler Hoot,
when I
hey,
was...
just get the weight under control and then you can use more angry.
That's the thing. Could have done this when I was 20, but I was told for so many years that my lungs were, you know, it could never work out. I could never exercise, and it just... I'm really happy that I'm down to 212. I mean, I'm gunning for as low as I can, and then I'm going to get a skin surgery to get rid of all this fucking extra skin on my stomach. But, with all the happiness is that little bit of, God damn it, I could have done this 20 years ago. Oh, well. I'm watching listening to a political ideology thing where he's talking about all the different ideologies, if you couldn't tell.
Back.
So what's your new job?
Tyler Hoot,
Halfway
LOL
through
having
this
fun with
quadrant,
Chip,
then
tongue sticking
remember
out.
that I have to hold my microphone, so here we go again. We have now moved from authoritarian right over to the left, and we are now in the authoritarian left. While still very pro-government, a lot of the ideas in here are more related to workers' union than things similar, as well as more distribution between the nation's people and more communal efforts, but we'll get to that. And since the center of the entire compass is now here, we're going to start here and work our way out. Laborism is basically more of an idea than it is a form
Tyler
of
Hoot,
government.
but doing IT
and it
work just now
essentially
full-time, just
says
first-line
that
support,
the
but I deal with a
working
lot of
class should
complex
be
stuff that's not entry
prioritized
level.
within a form of
Nice!
government.
Congratulations,
In other words,
man.
those responsible for production should be a heavy hand, if not the entirety of a nation's government. This comes back to an idea we're going to see more across this quadrant, which is the idea that those who control the means of production are the ones who need to be prioritized when it comes to a nation's either well-being or control. Then just to the left of that is distributism. Distributism is basically saying that there needs to be shared ownership of a nation's assets. This is different from socialism, whereas socialism
Tyler
is the
Hoot,
belief
so I get
that
paid not
wealth
entry level
should
since
be
I'm not
equally
entry level
shared
LOL since I
among
clean
the
up project
people.
work just anything that's a cat or
Distributism is
anyone
the
drags in.
idea that
Nice.
sources of capital need to be shared between people. An example of this would be co-ops, where a group of people who are responsible for the production
really happy
of the
for you,
business
man.
also profit from the capital of it, and essentially the idea that more things need to be ran like that. And then just above that, we have social nationalism. That thing I talked about earlier, the whole rule of averages, that if someone has an extreme left belief and an extreme right belief, they'll come out in the center. This is a pretty good example of that.
Tyler Hoot,
Basically,
oh, I'm happy
it's
as a clam now. This
nationalism,
comapney
which we
actually cares
talked
about the
in
people.
the last quadrant, with
Hey, it had to happen eventually, right?
a full socialist economy within.
Oh, if you're curious about the weight loss thing, I have a video about it on my YouTube. If you scroll back enough, it's called the weight loss video.
Tyler Hoot, LOL.
So, my hope is that it can inspire some other poor bastard who is where I was, you know? Because I don't want the whole weight loss thing to end with me. I want to help other people. So I've also reacted to a bunch of weight loss stuff, so I'm trying to diversify. I'm trying to diversify my portfolio, if you will.
In that nation. So most often this is racist, as you could imagine, and is very economically supportive of the group of people that it favors. While not
Tyler Hoot, hey, if you ever get a chance with Game Pass or just grab the game, try Hi-Fi Rush. Have you seen that game?
Redistribution of wealth implies
I've heard of it. I feel like it, because it's a rhythm game, I wouldn't do very well in it. But I've heard really good things about it.
some level of a high government. So because of all that stuff
Tyler
factored
Hoot,
in at
oh, my
once,
regime is
it
hell.
shows up here. Then just to the left of that is unionism. This can have a lot of definitions. Basically, as it's put here on the political compass, it's
Tyler
the
Hoot,
idea
it
that
doesn't
there
punch you for
needs
bad
to
rhythm.
be a
Oh, I thought it
equality in
did.
Power. In other words, things like lobbying within governments is frowned upon, and in other words, things like people or farmers
Tyler
markets
Hoot,
or
it just
whatever
read you for
have an
good.
equal say
Ah.
in either the government or what happens to them. And then over here, just above laborism, we have Christian democracy. This is a pretty centrist ideology, except when it comes to economics, it can be kind of left, which is why it shows up here. The
Tyler
idea
Hoot,
is you
so it's still
basically
playable.
have a form of liberal democracy in which people have the ability
Well,
to
then
vote.
I will
It
add
just
it
basically
to
has a
my
Christian foundation. In other words,
wish
principles
list.
of law and how government should be ran are taken from the Bible, which is the reason it's often seen as a leftist idea, because ideas of giving to the poor and helping the needy.
Oh, it is.
are
It's already on my
practiced
wish
through
list.
state
Cool.
funds. And then this big block to the left of that is Castroism. Castroism
Blech.
is the ideology of the Cuban leader Fidel Castro. The core tenets of Castroism are things like a turning down of private property in favor for public interest, or in other words, you don't own a farm, the state owns a farm so that they can help everyone else, as well as a strong military and unity within a nation. And while it's not overly authoritarian against its own people, and it's not really progressive. As a matter of fact, several of Castro's ideas would be considered the opposite of progressive by today's standards. His economic and military policies would place him here on the compass. And then above those, we have kleptocracy. Kleptocracy is a weird one. It quite literally translates to rule of thieves, and it operates as exactly that, a form of corrupt collectivism, in which whatever members of government exist accumulate public funds and most often misuse them. Even though this phrase is kind of used as an insult of governments, technically you have a small group of people collecting funds and then redistributing them as they see fit, and there's also a clear hierarchy of chain.
Robin Hoodism.
So,
Lol.
I mean, technically that's a left-wing socialist policy. And then just left of that is technocracy. You could kind of think of technocracy as the opposite of a representative government. Basically, it's the idea that those who have the best technical standards to take over government should be the ones to do so. Or in other words, the smartest or strongest of a people should be the ones leading. The reason it's considered a technocracy is because in most modern theory, either a test or some algorithm would determine who was best suited to rule. But it's essentially saying some are better than others, and those some should be the ones in charge. And then just left of that is social gospel. Social gospel is a political movement that began in the early 1900s. It was basically one of the early foundations of the progressive movement. Basically, ideas like racism and child slave workers within factories were challenged on a biblical principle. In other words, people began to ask, if the Bible says love everyone as thy neighbor and we should take care of children, why are we racist, and why are children cleaning out ovens in factories? The core tenet of the entire thing being on earth as it is in heaven, or the idea we should try to be as Christ-like as possible while on earth. The reason I guess this is considered a more authoritarian idea, because you can definitely see why it's considered to the left, or at least progressive, is because there was a lot of push from the state in order to enact these policies, like, you know, child labor laws and other super lame laws like that. So sort of a semi-authoritarian progressive movement in order to stop making people mean. And then just to the left of that is dingism. This is a modern idea within Southeast Asia. The easiest way to describe it is socialism with capitalist ideas. So essentially, you still have a redistribution of wealth and a state-overlooked economy. However, there are some things like semi-free markets and private business. And while compared to everything else over here, it's kind of culturally right, the fact that it is technically a form of socialism puts it over here on the left. And then above all of those, we have futurist. This is an overarching idea that the primary goal of a society should be to progress their technological stance. Or in other words, advancements in things like healthcare, science, and robotics, supersede everything else. Because of this and the funding and sort of think tank mentality it would take to achieve a futurist world, it's naturally kind of authoritarian and left, because you need everyone to be in on it, and you also need some sort of fund collection. And then to the left of that, we have state capitalism. State capitalism is quite literally a for-profit government. In other words, the state itself can be shareholders and produce products that it uses to make money off of. Whereas there's a lot of accusations in modern governments that people do it behind the scenes. This is quite literally like the state is trading stock on the public marketplace. Now, in other ideas for this, the state is just sort of a contender, or in other words, the state would have to trade money or resources with other pre-existing companies. However, you know, if there's like 5 different companies competing with each other and one of them's the government, things get a little lopsided. And then just left of that is Titoism. Titoism was specifically seen during the Cold War in Yugoslavia, so, you know, kind of a niche idea. And as far as principles go, it's kind of like a diet communism or diet version of whatever the USSR was doing, because it was basic ideas of like unity between workers or protecting yourself through community members and yada yada. You could think of this as a lot of communist theory without the, you know, gulags and other genocides that communism is commonly associated with, or at least the ones we'll get to in a bit. Jumping back down here, we have left populism. Left populism is exactly that. It's taking a leftist economic approach to whatever the public capabilities are. It's basically very anti-elitist, and
I swear to God, I just leave the damn thing off until he stops. What has got you so excited? Huh. I haven't heard you that excited from StarCraft in a long time.
and has a focus on the workers or common people of a group, and is the idea of focusing on the little guy while condemning the actions of those up top. Then just above that, we have Ho Chi Minh thought. This is the idea of Vietnam during the American War with Vietnam, hence the name Ho Chi Minh thought, and it follows basic ideas like having a group of workers that, in the case during Ho Chi Minh's time, are used to defend one's nation, as well as the idea that the working class are the most important and therefore should be prioritized in decision making. Down and to the left, we have collectivism. This is just the overall idea that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, and that in several cases, it's best for one's own personal agency to suffer for the benefit of the group, which is your basic ideas of share the wealth and other common leftist economic beliefs. Just above that, we have agrarianism. Agrarianism is the basic idea of equality among different peoples, and most often is seen in a lot of sort of farming or rural communities, and basically holds the idea that the little guy has just as much a say as anyone else, and puts a focus on the more often forgotten about people within a society, like the farmers, being the main focal point for how decisions are made. And then right above that, in the complete opposite direction, we have social transhumanism. So transhumanism itself we'll talk about later, but as a short version now, it is the idea that priority in a government should be to exceed the capabilities.
Bro, what in the fuck is with that noise? I hate that noise so much. It hurts my head like you wouldn't believe. I don't know if it's actually being picked up on the mic, but he is whining very quietly. And I can't tell if it's just because he's breathing through his nose or if he's actually, you know, upset. But he does it all the time and it drives me nuts. Bro, what is wrong? Come here, what's wrong, Bubby? Why are you breathing like that? Don't breathe like that, it freaks me out. One more love, is that what it is? See, I knew, I'm positive he knows he's doing it, because once I come over here and pet him, he stops doing it. What's wrong, Bubba? Let me cover you up. Let me snug you. I'm gonna snug you. There you go, Bubby. There you go, Bubba. Just snug you. Snug you proper. There you go. There you go. There you go. Ooh, lovely. Ugh. Okay, I'll be right back real quick. Sorry, that was just absolutely dark around here. That's okay. The ice is tiny. I half think he does it on purpose, and I half think he doesn't. But he'll. Chippy, for Christ's sake. Fucking cover you up, and what do? You leave. Bastard. Anyway, I will be right back. I'm going to refill my coffee real quick, since I'm already on a pause. Maybe I should have like music in the background or something. There we go. Got my coffee. Now, about 15 seconds or so, Chip will be scratching at my door. Or at least that's my guess. Shit. Oh, damn eyes. And just check the chat. Okay. Check this other stuff.
Of what humans are capable of, or in other things like biotech or robotics are the future of humanity. So social transhumanism is the idea that the best way to achieve that is through a socialist or shared wealth economy. So redistribute the money as much as possible so that we can make robot people. And that whole thing I talked about earlier, how if two things are near each other, it doesn't mean they're similar. Social transhumanism being right above the farmers co-op should be pretty good proof of that. And then above those two, we have conservative socialism, which this one's pretty much what it sounds like. It's a socialist economy with conservative or traditional values. The commonality between those two ideologies is, for one, you need a state to redistribute the wealth, and on the other side, you need a state to instill or maintain family values. So conservative socialism is having a state to make people continue life the way you want them to and make sure they share their money. Right above that, we have Chavism, which is the ideology of Venezuelan leader Hugo Chavez. The basic ideas he put forward were of a very controlling or at least militaristic state, and the large amount of socialism or redistribution was primarily done as a means of increasing the military power. So Chavism is basically the idea of shared wealth as a means of maintaining one's own military capabilities. And then jumping down here for our first one on the left wall, we have Orthodox Marxism. Orthodox Marxism is kind of meta because it's the original idea of Marx. However, Orthodox Marxism was established after Marx died, so it's people trying to get back to the original way Marx used to be. So yeah, but it's basically the idea that the only way forward for a nation is to have a completely classless society, or in other words, everyone is completely equal when it comes to decision making and wealth. This also puts the control of state affairs directly into the people's hands and works as a sort of insisted equality. And then right above that, we have Trotskyism, which suitably is the ideology of Leon Trotsky. The best way to describe Trotskyism, or at least in my completely uneducated opinion, is it's orthodox Marxism with government action put into it. And I use the term government loosely. Basically, a small group of people who have the capability to cause a revolution that will eventually lead to orthodox Marxism. We're going to talk about more in a second, but it's basically the idea that a small group of people can act like the state for a while in order to get the people to a place in which they can live in a more socialist perspective, to which they can then step back and achieve orthodox Marxism. It's sort of an ends justify the means approach to government. And then right above that, we have Leninism. Leninism essentially operated as the prelude to communism, and whereas orthodox Marxism is the idea everyone should be equal, Trotskyism is the idea that you can push a little bit in order to get to a place where everyone can be equal. Leninism is an active step-by-step guide of how to achieve that. Basically, it focuses on something known as the Vanguard Party, which is the idea that a small group of leaders will step forward and be leaders for a while in order to throw out the old capitalist or bourgeoisie, which is a fancy way of saying the high up in charge, or upper class, or whatever, you get the point, and then hand control back over to the people. As mentioned, Leninism is a much more active or direct action form than the two that I mentioned previously, and in practice is very anti-capitalist, and by that, I mean if there are businesses or people that are maintaining a wealth or class status above other people, then Leninism gets rid of them either by throwing them out of the country or throwing them out of existence. Also, a core idea with Leninism, and this also kind of applies to Trotskyism, is the revolution has to be maintained in people's eyes forever. So essentially, you build up a bunch of energy in order to get them to a place in which they can achieve a socialist society, and then you keep the momentum going by saying that they're still fighting the fight, and that's why a lot of sort of leftist literature you read or leftist posters that you see encourage things like we're all together fighting the good fight.
Yeah. Hang on. Are you done fucking around? You gonna lay down? You gonna lay down? You can lay down on the bed if you want. Wanna lay down on the bed? You can play with your bone. You go lay down? You all ass man that I'm not paying attention to you. Huh? Is that what it is? You want me to pay attention to you? Up up? Up on the bed? No? Okay. Come here, you want me to pay attention to you? Okay. You. Should we snug you? Can we cover you up? Hang it? What's your buddy? Your buddy? Love my buddy. I love my buddy. Let's try this again, shall we? Let's try this again, shall we? There you go. Please don't make that noise again. Fucks with my head like you would blow. You know what I should do? Whenever you make that noise, I should get a dog whistle and blow it at you. Fucking dog. I love him dearly, but I hate that noise. It really does hit me like a dog whistle. Because it's the tone, it's too high. Anyway.
Because it keeps up the idea that the fight's never over. So, short version, maintaining a small group of the state for a while in order to get rid of the bad people and then create a new system in which people are more equal and there's a socialist society to which the state can then dissolve itself. And then coming back over here, we have monarcho-communism, which is another perfect example of that whole rule of average thing. So, it's the idea of having a monarchy and a communist society at the same time. So it's the right-wing idea of divine right to rule and kings and queens and all that mixed with the far left idea of a communist state. So in practice, you would have a born ruler who had the privilege to rule at birth or whatever, ruling or reigning over a group of people who are trying to maintain a classless society between themselves, but they have a king. So yeah, also
sounds like
not
bread
a lot
and
of people know this,
circuses.
one of the core tenets of communism is that the state eventually goes away. Basically, you have a very powerful state.
You wouldn't fucking know it.
To get the workers groups together, and then the state disappears. However, if you have that along with a monarchy and like a born lineage, does like the king leave eventually, or just like does he just like kind of disappear into the air? Obviously, this is a high-up ideology because it's ideas of communism and monarchism, but it comes out in the middle of the two basically because it's very far left and very far right. And I'm pretty sure this is impossible, but if not, please explain to me how it's any different because I legitimately would like to know. And then right above that, we have Baathism. So Baathism is a form of Arabian nationalism. So while it's very, very right-wing when it comes to their beliefs and practices, it also advocates for public ownership and a sort of unity between Arabs. And it also emphasizes a vanguard party or small group of elites who can flip over a government like Leninism. Only in Baathism, they don't really go away. So it sort of comes out as a middle road, again, because of averages, because it's very left when it comes to, like, economy and peoples, and very right when it comes to, you know, traditions and beliefs. And overall, very pro-government. And then just to the left of that, we have left-wing nationalism. Left-wing nationalism is pretty much the idea of having a socialist or communal society that you shut off and violently defend it from anyone who says otherwise. This would be the mindset of people like Che Guevara or the IRA. Essentially, it's a very pro-leftist government and maybe even progressive with some of their beliefs, although Che was not progressive at all in his beliefs, but holds the stringent idea of leaving us alone within our socialist state or will literally kill you. And then to the left of that, we have Mugabeism. This is named after Robert Mugabe, who was the leader of Zimbabwe. And while when it comes to the economy within the state, it's a very Marxist-Leninist ideology, what keeps it from being all the way left is Mugabe was sort of a black nationalist and very violent against outsiders to the region, and is most known for the authoritarian military regime, which is the reason due to social politics he's over to the left and due to the overwhelming government policies way up north. Right above that, we have Xiism. This is in reference to the modern leader of China. So That should say enough. Holds ideas of a socialist state as well as the government always being correct. So full censorship, full putting away of personal agency, and the government's always right. Just don't question it. If you question it, you get shot. Just trust me. Nothing happened at Tiananmen Square. Why are you asking? Left of both of those, we have anti-revisionism.
That's great.
An idea that cropped up after Stalin lost power and Khrushchev came to power. Or I should say Stalin died, but he still lost power, so I'm still right. And it's basically the idea that Russia was ran the correct way under Stalin, and new people who want to back off of his principles need to stop. Or essentially, it's people who had the communist ideal and then didn't like the way that the country was going because of it. So they pretty much said, actually, let's let the state stick around and never dissolve it. And then for our first leftist ideology that touches the roof, we have eco-fascism. Now, this is still fascism that I talked about on the right quadrant, which is the ideas of nationalism and the people preserving what they have, but it's specifically applied to nature. So since that's sort of a leftist ideology, this one pretty much comes out on the center. And it's pretty much the idea of having a totalitarian state whose overall purpose is to do what's best for nature and make sure other people don't do something against it. To the left of that, we have Juche, which is the form of government in North Korea. And that explains why it's on the top. Pretty much 100% control of the normal people's lives is controlled by the government. And while there's a sense in equality in the fact that everyone's poor, there's a very clear ruling class that distributes money to the quote-unquote working class. So I mean, technically it's left, kind of, sort of. It's more pro-government than anything, though. To the left of that is something known as Strasserism. Strasserism was developed by the Strasser brothers right before Nazi Germany in World War II, and it's pretty much Nazism, and then add in the fact that no one can own anything and there's no private businesses. So it's a full form of socialism controlled by the state within what would have been Nazi Germany. So keep all the racist principles and the genocides and all that, and also no one can own anything, and it's fully public markets, basically. And then to the left of that, there's Maoism, named after Chairman Mao of China. So in theory, Maoism is Leninism, only those vanguard people I talked about have to be commoners, or basically rather than getting a few people to lead everyone leads themselves. However, in practice, there is a ton of authority worship. Like, people saw Chairman Mao as essentially some form of God that couldn't be touched. So because of that, whenever he enacted something, they weren't one to question the will of God. Which is the reason while his things like the Great Leap Forward ended up killing about 55 million people through a famine, but ideas that we see other places up here of the government always being right, Mao was kind of the forerunner of. And then to the left of that is National Bolshevism, also known as Red Fascism. It's pretty much fascism, only full communist when it comes to economy and workers' markets. So keep all the racism, keep all the nationalism and all that stuff, and then they want a full communist government, only the state never dissolves. So imagine like a really, really racist China. I am simplifying it a bit, but it's extreme ideas of nationalism combined with a permanent communist regime. And then finally, in the top left corner, we have Stalinism, which is, of course, the ideas of Joseph Stalin during and after World War II. So remember how, like, when it comes to Leninism and communism, the idea is the state exists for a while, or the vanguard party or whatever exists for a while in order to get to a classless society, and then they leave. So imagine all of the drive and power needed to achieve that, and then they never intended to leave at all, not one bit. Stalin came to power and had anyone who disagreed with him executed or thrown in prison. In one of history's most extreme cases of totalitarianism, he ended up killing about 48 million people through his decisions when it came to famines and who was to be executed and etc. And it is probably one of the most extreme examples in history of someone getting all the power and then doing everything wrong with it. But at least like when Mao had the Great Leap Forward, it was to convert the country from a rural industry into like a tech and, you know, like city urban industry. It didn't work and was a horrible idea and killed potentially more people than Stalin, but at least he had a point. Stalin just didn't like people and had him killed. I remember in one story about Stalin, according, and I'm not sure the validity of this, it could have been disproven, but it kind of fits. Whenever he was on his deathbed, he was asleep for a few days, and then I believe it was his daughter watched him as he woke up, looked at the ceiling, shook his fist at the sky, and died. And fighting God is the appropriate way to describe everything that man ever did. And now we are on to the bonus wacky off the compass ideologies. Starting down here on the left with communalism. Communalism is most easily described as, remember the Confederacy thing I talked about earlier? And how it's a loosely strung together group of independent nations or independent states. Well, imagine that, only instead of states, it's like farms and private groups of people. So in other words, you have these small communities that share everything with each other, and they share with other communities, and it's a big kumbaya sharing circle. All right, so this is one of my favorite wacky ideologies on the whole thing, posadism. So you know how like with like Lenin and theoretically with Mao and stuff, the whole idea is you need a powerful state in order to get to communist or socialist ideas. Well, posadism also wants to get to socialist ideas, but it says the only way to do that is through a nuke, and I'm not kidding.
Is
The idea
through a
with
nuke.
posadism is that the only way we can achieve a truly leftist world is to nuke the pre-existing one because it's too tainted. And then from the ashes of that, in a very Fallout-esque fashion,
I was wondering if he'd say it.
leftist society. There's like at least 3 people out there that unironically subscribe to that. This next one is too long to spell out on the board. However, it stands for fully automated luxury space gay communism, which is
What the
a
fuck?
of all the leftist ideas of people being taken care of and being classless and progressive and whatever. It's we all go to space and we're all gay and we're communists. So yeah. And then off the top left corner of the compass, we have hive mind collectivism, which if you've ever heard the critique against socialism or communism, that everyone has to think together at the same time and we all follow the same ideas, this is saying that that is a good thing. And not only is it a good thing, we should all hook our brains into one collective technology sphere where we're all controlled by one
The
thought and we all share
infosphere.
thoughts, and we're all just like part of a giant hive. So like the stereotypical joke about leftist ideas, it wants that. Like how on the right there was like the comedic cartoon level capitalist, this is the comedic cartoon level communist. And then remember how on the right side there was an idea up here on the left that I couldn't get to because it was dead center in the middle? That is ing socialism. I think that's how it's pronounced. The reason it's dead center is because it doesn't care about morality or economy or anything else. You know the book 1984? Okay, well this is the government from 1984. And it's saying the whole thing, the Big Brother is watching, you give your entire agency to the state and the state controls everything. This is saying that's a good thing. And it's not technically left or right because it's just all about control. So right in the middle above everything else, you have a super powerful Big Brother government that wants nothing but the best for you. And if you question it, they'll kill you. So we are now done with both authoritarian quadrants of the compass. I'm going to change shirts, and when we come back, we are going to talk about the libertarian left ideologies. We are now on to the libertarian left quadrant, which is on the bottom left. This is the first quadrant that we are going to see a progression away from government rather than a progression towards government. While this will maintain some beliefs that we saw in the previous quadrant about community and people working together, this one will have more of a focus on social issues as well as people's individual worth, as well as the aforementioned push from less government eventually to being actively anti-government. So let's get started. So since the new center is up here at the top right, we're going to start here and work our way out. With our first one, progressivism. Progressivism isn't as much of a political ideology as it is a sort of policy. It's basically the idea that in tech, social, and economic places, progress can be made towards a better collective goal. Or basically aspects of the human condition can be improved through learned behavior and essentially works as a means of social reform. Directly beneath that is welfarism. Now this isn't the policy of welfare, which is something else, although you could say the two are kind of related. Instead, this is a form of thought that asks about the consequences of an action. Or in other words, say there's some policy change or someone new coming to power or what have you. Welfarism is the idea of acting what it could possibly happen or who could possibly be hurt by this action. So say a government wants to outsource jobs to another country. A welfare's chief concern would be what happens to the pre-existing workers. It's essentially a humanitarian way of looking at cause and effect. To the left of that, we have eco-transhumanism. Now, this is one of those wacky ones that's here because it's technically like kind of caught in the middle, so bear with me. It is the idea that the ecosystem and nature are paramount, and therefore we need to increase technology in order to help it. Now, while more moderates within this ideology think that that is done by creating green energy or renewable energy sources that won't harm the planet, the full extent of this is that we need to rapidly get to the point to where space travel is possible so that part of the population can leave the Earth and therefore protect it. So, space race in order to save the trees. Yeah. Just beneath that, we have liberal democracy. This is the ideas of liberalism that we talked about earlier, applied directly to a democratic government. Or essentially the ideas of the individual being protected in a system in which the individual decides what happens. Or group of individuals, you get the point. This is where you see things like separation of powers in different branches of government, and the system itself is built all around as a means of protecting human and individual rights. And then down to the right of that, we have Nordic liberalism. Nordic liberalism is a practice that's seen in Europe, and it's basically the idea of capitalism, but with a social safety net. As with the majority of current world governments, there's things like public sector jobs and private economy and yada yada. But the main focus of a Nordic democracy is that for the poor and needy, there are social systems in place to help them. And then past that, their main concern is whatever makes the populace happy. When a lot of people talk about wanting capitalism with social programs, it's normally something like this they're referring to. And then beneath that, somehow, is technological primitivism. Okay, so bear with me here. This is the idea that technology and modern industry is good, but the society that has been created because of it is not good. So therefore we need to create technology, and it means that it can continue to progress but without social progression. In other words, iPhone good, iPhone rot your brain. Make iPhone that do good but no rot brain. Again, that whole thing I mentioned earlier about just because two things are next to each other doesn't mean they're similar. Yeah. And then to double down on that point, we have accelerationism. So accelerationism is like a sort of more tame version of the wacky posadism I mentioned earlier. It's basically the idea that in order to get to the way society is supposed to be, we have to destroy this society by the means of its current reputation. The reason this is considered a leftist ideology, even though it could technically be anywhere on the compass, is because it's most often targeted against capitalism and towards socialism. So basically it works like this. Say I absolutely hate capitalism and want a full socialist government. Well, I don't see a way to defeat capitalism as it currently stands, so therefore I become a capitalist and practice as many evil business ventures as humanly possible so I can destroy the system so that we can get to socialism quicker. Again, like posadism, but instead of like literal nukes, it's like metaphorical money nukes, basically. Those were three real weird ones back to back. So anyway, getting back on track, beneath that one, we have social democracy. This is basically the idea that social or socialist policies are best played out through a democratic lens. However, rather than enforcing them, people should be convinced through voting to vote in new policies rather than having them imposed on them. It's basically an actively applied form of progressivism with more sense of agency when it comes to the individual voter. To the left of that, we have greenism. This is exactly what it sounds like. The idea that nature has to come first when it comes to decision making, and that ecology is the number one issue whenever it comes to how money's to be spent or what have you. And most practical applications of this have some way of having a government to enforce pro-green policies. But more importantly than that, there's the idea that the government should leave the planet alone, which is why it's more of a libertarian thing than something like eco-fascism is. Back down here, we have syndicalism. So remember earlier when I talked about confederacies and basically the idea of having these powerful states that are sort of loosely connected? So syndicalism is that, but instead of states, it's things like farmers co-ops or workers unions. Basically, small groups or syndicates are placed together however best fits, depending on if they're all the same production, like farmers or industry, or just people based on their area, to which trade is then performed between them, and there's sort of a loose connection keeping it all together. Imagine it as an interconnected group of free unions. To the left of that is democratic socialism. And this is exactly what it sounds like. It's a socialist state in which the money is shared and the means of production are controlled by a collective rather than private businesses. However, the leaders of that socialist country are voted by the workers and members of that country themselves. So exactly as it says, it's a democratic socialist state. And just beneath that is democratic confederalism. So a decentralized group of people, like I've talked earlier with confederacies, and then those groups have the ability to pick who runs the connective government between them. The reason, obviously, that you can see the confederalism is considered more libertarian or more liberty-oriented than socialism is because in socialism, no matter how you phrase it, it's one state that sort of mandates what the others does, and in confederalism, the centralized state is much weaker. We're getting to the point where things are going to start drifting away from less government to being actively anti-government. Just to the right of that, we have environmentalism. And environmentalism is more so the idea that the environment should be the limiting factor in a lot of decisions. In other words, this is a policy for government to follow, and this is rules that the government cannot break. But in theory, greenism would be when someone says, hey, maybe the government should do more recycling programs, and environmentalism is more of, if you destroy this rainforest in South America, bad things are going to happen. It doesn't have to be that violent, but it certainly can be. Then just to the right of that, we have market socialism. And as it says, it's a socialist state with free markets. So basically you have these collectively owned groups like co-ops that can operate in an open market where they can earn wealth and then disperse them or divvy it among themselves however they please. In other words, basically a capital influence socialism, which is what drags it more to the right, but overall very non-controlling in a governmental sense of how people keep and manage their money. But overall very non-controlling in the authoritative sense, because it not only says that people can divvy up money how they want, it also says they can make it how they want. Over here against the left wall, we have left communism. Left communism is essentially communism with a sort of praxis attached to it. So you know how communism's whole thing is that it's a classless society, but there's the little caveat that in order to get there, you have to have a very powerful government as a means of instituting that classless society. Well, left communism is skipping the whole powerful government part. It's essentially the idea of maintaining true equality without establishing essentially a faux bourgeoisie state, and in practice is essentially jumping to the worker communitive group that shares wealth without going through the whole dictator evil Stalin part. Directly underneath that is Luxemburgism. This is inspired by Rosa Luxemburg, who pretty much was a left communist with sort of progressive beliefs. As rather than favoring politically left parties, she more so favored workers' unions and other things that she considered to be where the politicians were claiming they were at, as well as instituting modern social programs or at least social ideas of equality. So you wouldn't be far off to say Luxemburgism is a practically applied idea of left communism. So you wouldn't be far off to say Luxemburgism is a practically applied version of left communism.
Why are you repeating yourself?
That is council communism. This is one that in research I'm not 100% sure on, so forgive me if I'm a little off. But from my understanding, council communism essentially came from the same idea that these two came to, in that establishing a party in order to achieve communism and then hoping that they give up that power later doesn't always work out. So instead, it's the idea that a small council is put together whose main purpose is solely to make sure someone else doesn't try to take over, as well as pretty much just providing propaganda in order to get people riled up and working towards one cause. So they're more social or figurehead leaders than anything else. So that way, once the quote-unquote revolution is over, they don't have any power to maintain because they never took power to begin with. Again, another practically applied version of left communism. Jumping back over to the right, we have Georgism. Or I'm pretty sure it's Georgism, but I like Georgism better. The reason it's over here, pretty much in the center of the entire compass, is because it finds a weird way to balance capitalist ideas with socialist ideas as well. Pretty much it works like this. The majority of leftist ideas, or at least far leftist ideas, are against private ownership of property. The idea being that people can buy up property and then landlords come into play, and the left doesn't like landlords. And the right doesn't like taxes because the right feels that they earn their money and the government has no right to touch it. So Georgism is the idea that there is only one tax, a land tax. Now this does two things. It leads to a lot less money for the government to randomly spend, so therefore it creates a smaller government. And while cutting back on taxes that the right would be paying, it de-incentivizes the idea of hoarding land. Because if someone's going to buy a ton of land and that's the only thing that they have to pay taxes on, they're not just going to want to own a ton that they're not using. So less people pay taxes, the government gets smaller, everyone's at least periodically happy, and it causes an overall abundance of land for others. So sort of kind of anti-land ownership, sort of kind of anti-tax, and definitely anti-government, which is why it gets kind of in the center near the bottom. To the left of that is liberal socialism. So liberal tendencies, like I talked about earlier, are the ideas of the individual and one's own privacy, which is the idea of free markets and being able to interact with markets as you wish. And socialism is not that. Socialism is a form of collective wealth that then redistributes it. So liberal socialism itself is a sort of mixed economy in which people can participate in free markets, hence the liberal aspect, and the money is gathered in and redistributed, hence the social aspect. At least sort of gathered in and redistributed. There's a lot of equality in it on social values and liberty, and one of the only functions within a liberal socialism of the government is to redistribute whatever wealth is put into it, as well as breaking up monopolies that have a means of overwhelming the individual state of free markets.
I will be right back again because I have a thimble bladder. Woe is me, woe is me.
To the left of that is Mandelaism, or Mandelism. Mandelism, yeah, that's it. This is based off the ideas of South African President Mandela, and it's pretty much liberal socialism with a particular focus on helping the poor and needy, which was part of Mandela's whole reinitiative program that was meant to get South Africa back to a comfortable, sustainable place. So pretty much this with more of a poverty and helping the needy focus. And then to the left of that is Gandhism, which is named after Gandhi. So this is a lot of the ideas that I've talked about up until this point, of having a sort of sustainable system in which the most lower class, quote unquote, in a country are cared for. However, Gandhism had some particularly interesting anti-government sentiments. Now, this wasn't in a riotous sort of way. As a matter of fact, Gandhi himself was a very big pacifist, but was instead the idea of peaceful resistance. Now, this is because Gandhi himself was very big on teaching self-reliance and the idea that someone must be spiritually and physically capable of taking care of themselves, and it shouldn't be the government's place to do so. And whenever the government tries to do that, it's tyrannous. So essentially, help each other, help those who need it, which is a leftist over here ideology, and don't let the government tell you what to do, which makes it down here. And then to the left of that, we have classical Marxism. Classical Marxism is, as the title suggests, the idea of Marx's original teachings, and is essentially the idea that the idols of capitalism are so dangerous and there needs to be an active resistance against it. Or in other words, modern markets and consumerism is bad, and we have to actively oppose trade in that regard. There's a big push away from things like monetary gain and a big focus on trading, with things like co-ops and unions replacing pre-existing corporations and businesses, and the idea of trading product rather than consuming and hoarding the wealth of products. And the purpose of the government, as little as there would be in a worker-led country, is to prevent corporations from exploiting the common people and leading them back down the route of capitalism. And then back over here we have geo-libertarianism. I'll be totally honest with you guys. I can really not find the difference between these two, which I guess makes sense and is okay since they're right next to each other on the compass. But like whenever you look up stuff about geo-libertarianism, it talks about how its big thing is the one land tax, which, as I mentioned earlier, is like the Georgism thing. If I had to guess, there's even less focus on the state because there's still the one land tax. But I guess since it's more libertarianism, there's more of a focus on like free markets. But again, Georgism didn't really mention markets, but whatever. You can imagine this as Georgism, only there's more individuality or self-agency involved. And then to the left of that, we have anti-authoritarianism. This, in my opinion, could really fit anywhere on the south half of the compass. I guess the reason it's considered left is because it could also be used against things like corporations, which are more of a right idea. But in practice, it's just the idea of libertarian unity, that everyone down here and everyone over here to the right down here should band together if it means actively opposing tyranny in any regard. Perhaps that's the reason it's considered left, because there's a lot of unity involved in that concept. But it's pretty much the idea that everything stands second to resisting tyranny or authoritarianism whenever it comes into play. And then to the left of that, we have libertarian socialism. So this one's kind of weird to explain. The essence of it is it's essentially anti-wage slave. Basically, there's the idea that corporations and businesses are just as bad when it comes to enslaving people as governments can be. So therefore, in order to maintain true freedom or libertarianism, it must be done through a non-money centered society. So therefore, more social trading is to be done rather than markets and capitalism. And like syndicalism and confederalism that I mentioned earlier, there's a very weak connective state because the whole point of the ideology is to be as free as possible. So, you know, government is pretty frowned upon. And then to the left of that is libertarian market socialism. So this is, again, sort of a praxis for this one, libertarian socialism. It's pretty much the idea that there is a sort of universally shared market that kind of makes money pointless. In other words, sure, under some cases money could still exist. However, the primary driving point is that one market trades what it needs with another market, so therefore there's no wealth to be hoarded or greed or capitalism to get involved. And again, as mentioned with this one, it's another philosophy towards approaching true freedom, but it's a bit more hardcore on the money bad thing than libertarian socialism is. Directly beneath that is situationism. Situationism, from the best that I can determine, is essentially anti-market or anti-materialism. Basically, hoarding goods or wealth outside of your particular situation is bad, so therefore taking more than what you need is a form of greed. This is most often seen as a sort of live by your means lifestyle and a form or strategy to do away with the human idea of abundance of wealth. and is essentially an antithesis to the idea of living in abundance. And then just to the right of that, we have monarcho-socialism. So this is socialism, you know, shared workers' parties and all that, but the government is small, and I mean like barely even there. There's this thing I'm going to talk about more in a bit called the NAP. It's a shared belief within a lot of minarchist or anarchist groups, and it means the non-aggression principle. It's pretty much the idea that within an anarchist or stateless society, as long as you don't harm someone else, no harm should befall you. So in a minarcho-socialism group, money, wealth, economy, and all of that is dealt with by private parties, or wait, no, not private, hold on, by public parties that are not the state. That's better. And the only existence of the minute state that does exist, or the segregated states between certain groups of people, is to enforce the NAP, or essentially just stop or punish violent crime, and that's really it. Like, I am talking the fragment of government. The rest of these from here on to the end of this quadrant are all different anarchist ideologies. So with everything that I'm going to say, there's literally zero government, beginning with religious anarchism. This is most often seen within sort of homogeneous groups or groups of people that all believe the same thing, because for it to be a religious-based society, it kind of has to be. But it's basically the idea that the state itself is a form of idolatry, so therefore, in order to be appropriately religious or spiritual, you have to do away with it. And therefore, this homogeneous group would live by the principles of whatever religion they are practicing, and exist as a sort of shared help thy neighbor sort of group, but without any government involvement. And then just to the right of that is anarcho-pacifism. So anarcho-pacifism is sort of a very hardcore interpretation of the idea of having no rulers, because it's pretty much saying that violence itself can be used as a form of rule over someone else. So therefore, using a form of rule in order to stop another rule is contradictory. And because a state can't really exist without either taking money from their own people or enforcing laws on their own people, it itself is a form of tyranny, and pretty much an embodiment of the entire idea of just wanting to be left alone. And then for our first one, on the bottom of the compass, we have anarcho-mutualism. Now, again, there's no government here, and as with the last two I discussed and the ones moving forward, there's not really a way to enforce this practically. It's pretty much an idea of how it should be set up. But within anarcho-mutualism, the idea is, remember how over here I mentioned that like money bad? Okay, well here money no exists. And the market, which is a totally free and open market, because remember again there's no government, is therefore conducted by giving mutual worth for whatever product is being traded, or essentially a trade-based society. While in some interpretations of it there's a sort of credit bank that, you know, mutual worth of an item can be turned in for like labor tokens or whatever, but that's pretty much just like another form of money. The chief idea is to have an anarchist society with a totally free market, but not money, because money bad. And then to the left of that is anarcho-collectivism. So again, there's no government to really enforce this, but the idea behind it is that you would have these different groups of workers or different means of production within a group. So basically you have your farmers or your tradesmen or your smelters or whatever, and then each of those individual groups are controlled by the workers.
Okay, I'm way too tired.
And then like the lead theory in it is that, like, say for example the farmer group, they all farm, and then whatever they produce and sell off, they trade for like farmer bucks or whatever, and then the same applies to every other group, and then they can use those bucks to purchase things at the farmer store, which this all sounds like a really roundabout way of reinventing money, but whatever. What do I know? And also the whole coal mine thing that I talked about earlier, where you just had to buy stuff at the company store. But again, I'm not an expert, I'm probably wrong. But essentially these groups operate their own economy, independent within themselves, rather than having a state to overwatch them. And then left of that, we have queer anarchism. Queer anarchism essentially falls with the idea that modern society is so inherently homophobic and transphobic and the other phobics that the only way to get proper equality is to destroy the whole state and to just have a completely stateless society, and that is the means by which the quote-unquote queer can maintain a sense of equality. So essentially destroying the state as a means of achieving equal rights. Anarcho-feminism is the exact same thing with the goal of achieving feminism. And eco-anarchism is the means of achieving plant, or more specifically,
Plant.
that the only way to get a true ecological or natural society
I'm kind of amazed there isn't a Ludditism.
is by destroying a state that keeps encroaching on it. So it's pretty much the ultimate hardcore version of everything that has kind of been hinted about protecting nature. It's saying that nature cannot exist in safety as long as the government exists, so therefore get rid of the government. And then finally, in the bottom left corner, we have anarcho-communism. Anarcho-communism is essentially a state that exists post-money and post-ownership. It's the idea that no one owns anything, everything is to be traded, and people are to trade with each other in a completely classless, stateless, and ownerless society. This is a very giving and sort of gift-oriented ideology, with the idea that if someone needs help, you should give it to them. And you can pretty much picture the whole world as one big farm. We're all living in it. And now, on to the wacky off-the-compass ones. Starting up here with Bookchin communism, which is the form of communism put forward by Murray Bookchin. The easiest way to describe this is sort of the big farm idea of anarcho-communism, only instead there's like several farms, and the government that does exist is just like connecting the farms together. And when I say farms, I cannot stress enough how much I literally mean big farms. Essentially, there's no ownership and a created federalism between these free living groups of people. And then down here, we have anarcho-post-sadism. So remember how one of the wacky ones in the authoritarian left quadrant was the post-sadism, or the idea that we have to nuke everything in order to get to a communist society? Anarcho-post-sadism is that, only it's not to get to a communist society. It's to just blow everything up. It's the idea that the appropriate way of living is a true stateless and governmentless society, and the only way to get there is nuking everything we already got. I made the joke earlier that it was like the Fallout idea, but this is literally the Fallout idea. Like trading bottle caps in a post-apocalyptic world, raiders everywhere, and that's the anarcho-post-sadist dream. Also, in research for this, I have to mention everything that's unironically post-sadism talks about aliens and how they exist in an anarchist society. And the only way that we can achieve their higher level of existence is by blowing up what we got. I don't know what to do with that information, I just had to share it. And then down here off of the bottom of the compass, we have anarcho-primitivism. So you know how some
there's the Ludditism.
like anti-technology, or we should at least slow the roll when it comes to how fast we're developing? Well, anarcho-primitivism is the idea that we have gone too far and need to immediately go backwards all at once. This is the idea of actively rejecting modern technology in favor of sort of older world living, and is most famously been popularized by Ted Kaczynski, who wanted to blow up post offices because he said the Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been disastrous for humanity. So in short, return to monkey. And then finally, off the bottom left corner of the compass is soulism. Soulism is the idea that the only motivating factor that should ever hit you is your own desires. So absolutely zero
That's
government,
solipsism.
absolutely zero privacy, absolutely zero ownership. Anyone should be allowed to do whatever they want at any moment.
Wait.
And then whatever consequences they suffer are just part of the flow. With hardcore tenets of the soulist ideology, there's beliefs that if we completely put away our own sort of apprehension when it comes to doing whatever we want whenever we want, that we'll be able to do crazy things like transcend gravity. It's also part of their belief that gravity is one of those things that we should just simply refuse. So pretty much if it feels right, then you should do it. And not only should you do it, you have to do it, or you are putting away the only thing in the universe that matters, which is whatever you want it to be. So that is it for the libertarian left quadrant. Next, we are going to move over to the right with the libertarian right, which will be the final quadrant of the video. So I will change shirts and be right back. We are now on to the final quadrant, libertarian right. Much like what we saw in the last tier, these ideas get increasingly anti-government. However, unlike the last tier, instead of ideas of community and social wealth, this quadrant is much more focused on ideas of individual privacy and wealth security. So, since the center is now up here, we will start up here and move our way down, beginning with neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, which is an adaptation of liberalism, which on the compass is like right up here, we talked about it in the beginning, is essentially that, just liberal ideas, with a more heavy focus on freeing up businesses. So essentially liberalism, but you cut back on business regulations. Just right of that, you have general capitalism, and that is exactly what it says, just capitalism. Basically, you have private ownership of things as well as control of certain assets. In other words, people can start businesses, they can make money with those businesses, and then keep the money that they earned. And the market essentially runs for the profit of the owners or shareholders. Beneath those, we have social libertarianism. Social libertarianism is pretty much you have free markets and other ideas that are common with libertarianism, only there is a welfare state as well. So social programs mixed in with a libertarian market, which is why it's pretty much on the center of the compass. And then beneath that, we have libertarianism. The chief ideas of libertarianism is that of being autonomous and voluntary. Essentially, if you're consistently being forced to do things by the state that you don't want to do and you're not really bringing harm to anyone else, that is seen as a form of tyranny and should be resisted. It holds to the idea that people come first and not the government's interest, and above everything else comes the rights of the individual. And then sort of on that individuality route, to the right, we have transhumanism. This is the thing I mentioned earlier that showed up in the authoritarian left quadrant, and it's the idea that humanity should strive to reach a point past humanity in which biomechanics and robotics are used to enhance the human condition, or essentially humanity plus. The reason it's considered a lib-right ideology is because there's a huge focus on making the individual all that they can be, and supremacy of the individual is the chief tenet for a lot of stuff down here. So this one's really funny. It's kleptocracy again. Remember how up in the authoritarian left there was kleptocracy, which is essentially the rule of thieves? Well, up there it was saying that having a few people who redistribute the wealth, while they may not be the best people, is a good thing. Here it's implying that you are the one who is the thief and rule, and therefore that's a good thing. So it's really funny that it shows up both places. Up here as, well, even if they're thieves, there are a few people running the government. And here, well, even if I'm a thief, I'm still running the government. I suppose the reason it's here, jokes aside, is because it is a very capitalist view of government that a few people can essentially treat it like a business and use the funds as they wish. But yeah, kleptocracy, rule of thieves. And then beneath that, we have right Georgism. So again, Georgism is the whole single land tax thing. And right Georgism is that, only there's more so of a sort of focus on the freedom of markets and the individual. So pretty much all the ideas of Georgism that I mentioned earlier, plus people and their wealth get left alone even more so. There's still the land tax thing, but it's even more pro-capitalist, which Georgism itself wasn't necessarily anti-capitalist, but whatever. To the right of that, we have green libertarianism. So we're going to see a bunch of libertarianisms pop up here in a second that are all this, the thing I talked about, the individual reigns supreme and shouldn't be bothered, with a specific goal or direction in mind. So for example, green libertarianism is that plus the one thing that the state should really do is take care of the environment and leave everyone else alone. We're going to see several sort of directional libertarianisms pop up in a second. Up here we have capitalist transhumanism. So remember how whenever transhumanism was brought up in the authoritarian left, it was under socialist transhumanism, or basically the idea the easiest way to get to a transhumanism world is through socialism? Well, this is a different philosophy, saying the quickest way to get there is through private markets and the private sector. Or basically one business
The Elon Musk
can build profit as a means of actually achieving the transhuman idea. Then right of that, on our first one in this quadrant on the right wall, we have conservative libertarianism. So remember the whole like directional libertarianism things? This is that, but with conservative values. So not only is it the ideas of the individual and free economy, but it's also the ideas of preserving one's own culture, which is what pushes it all the way over to the right wall. It's also slightly, while still in, you know, the lib-right category, slightly more authoritarian, because while here you're saying, well, the government's purpose is to take care of nature, Up here you're saying, well, the government's purpose is to enforce my way of life, my sense of duty, my sense of law, blah, blah, blah. It's kind of like a my way or the highway application of libertarianism, and falls back on a legal application of one's own morality. Beneath that, we have classical liberalism. This is, as the name suggests, liberalism as it was originally defined. Basically, the idea that everyone is born and entitled with their own rights, as well as the rights to their own privacy and business, and the purpose of the government is to protect those said rights. Or, in other words, protect your business, protect you from being attacked by others, and protect your freedoms. A lot of people make the point that this is what a lot of the American founding fathers were, the idea that the sole purpose of government is to protect the rights of the individual. Beneath that, we have liberal corporatism. So this is basically liberalism applied to corporations, and the idea that corporations can do things like conduct business with the state directly. And while a lot of the theory around it says that corporations are encouraged to take care of their workers, we know how that goes. And it's essentially applying the individual rights that people get within liberal ideologies to corporations. And then right of that, we have democratic liberalism. So again, the ideas of liberalism that people have individual rights applied to democracy. So essentially, the idea that people should not be ruled unless they consent with the ruling. Or in other words, the government operates by the consent of the governed. Again, if you're familiar with American history, you can see how a lot of this language sounds very similar to a lot of the framework of the government itself. Beneath that, we have paleo-libertarianism. Paleo-libertarianism is those libertarian ideas, but with a specific direction towards the way things used to be. In practice, rather than having an overwhelming government in order to force morality, it's more the idea that one has the freedom to do right, or in other words, culture and tradition should be formed to discourage people from doing wrong rather than an oppressive state that just punishes them whenever they do it. In practice, paleo-libertarians really value their sense of privacy and hate interventionism. So the idea of going into another country and enforcing your ideas is not at all what they're about. They much rather stay within their own country and try to educate others to why their way of living
that's what I
is
used
the
to
most
be
beneficial.
for a while.
And then to the right of that, we have national libertarianism. So very similar to paleo-libertarianism, this is the idea that I want to be left alone and my entire country should be left alone as well. There's also, as the name suggests, a sense of national pride, but it's not in an enforced way as it is with more authoritarian ideologies. It's more of a tradition or belief sense, and it works towards cultivating a sort of homogeneous group of people, not in a race way, at least not usually, but more so in a belief and way of life kind of sense. They also hate globalism. This is pretty much the opposite of everyone living together interlinked, and very much so wants to be left alone. Jumping back down here, we have techno-liberalism, which sounds like an EDM band, but essentially says that the best way to achieve a liberal idea, or the idea of individuals being responsible for their own agency, is through developing technology that can best benefit them. So for example, if one was to believe freedom wasn't legitimate because there's too many people that have to rely on the state for things like healthcare, a techno-liberal would say that if we can upgrade healthcare or specifically cure certain diseases as a means of helping people, they'll be able to grow more autonomy. So it's essentially taking a transhumanism application to the idea of individual freedoms. And then to the right of that, we have neoclassical liberalism. This is core tenets of liberalism with a specific push towards social equality. Basically, the idea that people not only have inherent equal value when it comes to their capabilities in a voting system, but also in a social system as well. In most common applications, it sees the state as a means of maintaining this sort of semi-class structure and seeks to get to a point of true equality through emphasizing the individual rights of every citizen. So neolibertarianism is like on the ground floor with paleo-libertarianism, where, you know, like one's own individual freedoms matter, but then immediately after that they become exact opposites. Neolibertarianism is the idea that we are individually free and therefore everyone else should be too. This is where ideas like liberating the rest of the world come into play, which means they're pro-interventionism. Now, because it's down here in the libertarian section, this isn't the idea that we need to send our government's military and stuff like that to do it. It's more so an individual thing, or the idea that we as individuals should just go and fight for freedom in other places. So basically the idea that we think freedom is great, so therefore you're all going to think it's great too, and I'm going to shoot people to prove it. And then right of that is objectivism. So objectivism is more of a thought concept than an ideology. It's pretty much the idea that the way reality works and the way that we perceive it are not the same. And there is an objective reality that we're all working to get closer to. So what this essentially boils down to is the individual needs to do whatever they feel is best, or achieve whatever point they think is best for them as a means of getting to a place of happiness. Or basically, the pursuit of happiness is the most important thing a person can do. As it's used in application here, this is an idea towards material wealth or riches, and the idea that earning wealth isn't only okay, but morally justified. So minarchism is that thing I mentioned earlier, the smallest possible state that can exist, and its only point is pretty much to enforce the non-aggressive principle or the NAP. So a very, very small government who are only there to punish those that hurt others. The idea of government in these kind of states is referred to as the night watchman state, or basically, unless something goes wrong, you would never even know the government was there. Hence the term minarchism, because it's not technically anarchy, but it's really close. And then beneath that, we have Christian libertarianism. So libertarianism with the idea that the only state or only higher power that should be looked up to is that of God. Or in other words, whatever state exists is only there to uphold biblical principles. So be good to others, don't do evil, and at the end of the day, the only one that you really have to answer to is God. So as with other religious ideologies that we've seen before, it sort of works as a sort of homogeneous group of people who all follow the same belief pattern and therefore are less likely to break it. And then in a totally different ideology, but still close to it on the compass, to the left we have pink capitalism. This is a very strong application of consumerism, and basically is the principle that you can market to a group of people who feel underrepresented within a society. The ultimate application of this would be things like gay pride parades, where there are businesses who do not care at all for gay rights, but will sell hats with a rainbow flag on them for...
Yeah, that didn't sound familiar at all. Be right back. Okay, so I'm gonna be right back. I need to give Chip his last bathroom of the night. Chippy. Chippy. Come on, treat. Treat. Let's go. Let's go, treat. Come on, buddy. I gotta tell him. Nice. Come on, let's go. Okay. Good boy. Good boy, Chippy. Here, let's cover you up again. Let's cover you up again. Yeah. There you go. You're covered up. You're all snoodled. You're a good boy. Yes. You're a good boy going potty. Yes. You're a very good boy. I'm gonna be so proud of you. Yes, your mom gonna be so proud of you. Oh, I love you too. I love when you give me kisses. Yeah, show your body. Mwah. Good boy. Go. There's my booby. Here. Let her know that. Son of a fucking bitch. Yeah. In some game I never heard of. What is this? Poor Ron. Fuck. Christ on a bicycle. So as soon as it started, my flu was going away. Went from feverish. Went from fever to sweating it out in under 24 hours. All that's left is the green crap in my throat. Fuck March. March sucks. At least I can eat my pineapple blizzard tomorrow. What in the fuck are they talking about? Alright. Whoops. Alright.
$20 markup, and is essentially saying that it's totally okay to market products towards underrepresented people within society if you can make a profit off of them. We are approaching evil bad guy capitalism very rapidly. And then to the left of that, we have consequentialism. Consequentialism is pretty much a roundabout way of saying that the ends justify the means. Also, in practice, it's pretty much the opposite of welfarism, which I mentioned in the libertarian left category. Whereas that was the idea of what about what happens to XYZ group of people. This is saying, yeah, but if I do that, think about the XYZ thing that could happen. Again, back to the whole we're in the evil capitalist section now. It's the whole thing of, yeah, I may have to destroy a rainforest to do it, but if there's profit, and then jumping over to the left side, we have eco-capitalism. So this is the idea that nature, as it functions, is the base root of a market economy. Or in other words, the natural resources on Earth are finite, and therefore the perfect thing to base an economy off of for inherent worth. Therefore, harvesting too much essentially inflates the market and destroys whatever hope you have for a future investment. Because of this, things like the government or intervention from the government are very, very frowned upon, and government is seen as an overall bad, which is why it's so far down here. Or easiest way to describe it, it's looking at nature and ecology around us as a sort of business or market, and not in a bad, super corporate evil way, in a, if we can properly monitor funds, maybe we should properly monitor the trees while we're at it, and is essentially a market view approach of ecology. Also, if I haven't mentioned it plainly enough, the reason things like pink capitalism and consequentialism are so far down here is because it completely puts away government intervention. Or essentially, a lot of the times governments will have policies to keep businesses from doing shady practices, and these are shady practices that they don't want the government to intervene with. And then before we get into the final layer, we have anarcho-monarchism. So this is a joke, I'm pretty sure, I think. It's even a joke that J.R.R. Tolkien made at one point. So it's an anarchy, right? Which means there's no government, but it's also a monarchy, which means there is one of the highest forms of government that you're naturally born into. So the whole joke around it is that if it's an anarchy, that means technically everyone's their own government, which means you can be as powerful as you want. And since you are one person deciding everything that you do, that's the definition of an absolute monarchy. So everyone gets to be their own absolute monarchs. So head up.
We was kings.
We made it. And then starting on the bottom floor of the political compass, we have agorism. So agorism is one of those that isn't really an ideology and more of a practice or lifestyle as a means to get to a different ideology. The chief idea of agorism is that it functions as a sort of counter economy. Basically, if you don't like the state and you don't like the government runs things, then you should subvert the state in any way possible. The most common application of this is through things like gray markets and black markets. For those that don't know, gray markets are legal goods that are traded outside of the government's eye, or essentially as a means of either evading taxes or not appearing on the public record. And the black market is illegal items, once again traded behind the government's back. However, an interesting thing of note, agorism specifically puts away the idea of red markets, which red markets, if you don't know, is explicitly violent items or actions sold, again, away from the government's eyes. And by red, I mean like human trafficking or murder videos, and you get the point. Like, they're called red markets for a reason. And the reason for that is because it again violates that NAP that I talked about earlier, or the idea that you shouldn't be violent to others for no reason. So agorism essentially says that in whatever means you should subvert the state at all costs, either until it goes away or you can learn to live without it. And then just to the right of that, we have individualist anarchism. This is, like we talked about earlier, one of those forms of anarchism that is saying we need anarchy to get to this specific result. And this is kind of the chief thing a lot of people think about when they think of anarchy, and says that the only way that we can really have a true sense of freedom or individuality is without the government at all. So use anarchy or a lack of government as a means of truly maintaining freedom and a sense of personal agency. To the right of that is voluntarism. This is similar to agorism, more of a philosophy than an ideology. It's the idea that no one should have to do anything that they don't want to do. Again, with the understanding that like violence against other people and stuff like that doesn't count. Pretty much, if you don't want to pay taxes, you shouldn't pay taxes. If you don't want to be drafted into the military, you should never be drafted into the military. It's the idea that if anyone forces you to do something that you don't want to do under reasonable means, that's a form of tyranny and should be opposed. Which is naturally why it's considered an anarchist ideology, not only because it's a core tenet for anarchy, but like, if you say you don't want to pay taxes and don't want to do what a state tells you to do, that by definition doesn't go with any state. So as such an individualist and self-privacy and self-ownership idea, it fits in at the bottom right of the compass. Hoppianism is a form of anarchy in which capital and markets are focused on, and essentially advocates for 100% full free markets with zero government intervention, with the idea being that the government messes up everything it touches, so it shouldn't touch the markets. Ideas behind this are also very seclusionary, saying that the individual, like voluntarism, shouldn't be forced to do things they don't want to do. And an interesting philosophy within Hoppianism is a specific disdain for democracy. The reason for this being, the ideology says that in governments where there is inherent authoritarian control, people can easily tell who is controlled and who's doing the controlling. However, in a democracy, people can be convinced that the tyranny they're facing is their own decision. And according to the idea, it's worse to have a government where people think they're doing the right thing than a government where people know something bad is happening. So it is a very extremist form of individual freedom and market liberties. And then finally, in the bottom right corner of the compass, we have anarcho-capitalism. This is an idea that was put forward by Murray Rothbard, which is like, I can't stress how private and how free these markets are. Like, there is capitalism, and then there is every form of security or judgment or everything is ran by businesses in private sectors. It falls back on the whole ideology of the freer the markets, the freer the people. So therefore, the way to obtain 100% freedom is 100% non-controlled markets. And again, it's an anarchist ideology, so there's no state to enforce anything there is. Unless, of course, McDonald's becomes a super empire and then creates a McPolice force in order to enforce their ruling onto the iPhone countries, but I digress. But when it comes to levels of personal freedom, individuality, hating government, and full-blown capitalism, you can't get much more than a super military monarchy Taco Bell. So now that we are done with the compass, let's go over our final wacky off the compass ideologies. Our first being over here to the right with Dark Enlightenment. Okay, so the Enlightenment period is often referred to, at least in the term of governments, as the point in human history when people went from having one or two kings or conquerors that ruled them to the idea that they should be allowed to rule themselves. Well, Dark Enlightenment is saying that was a bad move for freedom's sake. Basically, it's the idea that over time, people want to be more and more taken care of and secure rather than free. So over time, people are voting their freedoms away. And unlike with normal tyranny or monarchy or whatever, people may get mad and eventually revolt. Whereas according to Dark Enlightenment, if they vote in the tyranny, then they're never going to do anything about it. So Dark Enlightenment is saying we need monarchs and super powerful leaders to 100% enforce freedom. Or essentially, history's been moving in the wrong direction. If we can get some totalitarian rulers to make sure we don't get any totalitarian rulers, we will be okay. Jumping down here off the bottom of the compass, we have egoism. This is the idea that self-interest and whatever you want supersede everything else as the ultimate form of individuality. I also like that it's down here where it's located, because if you remember all the way at the top, off the top of the compass was the 1984 super scary government, which it is true the exact opposite of that would be the idea that you can just do whatever you want and you should do whatever you want. Where this differentiates from soulism, which was off the bottom left corner, is soulism was more so about exciting yourself as a person, and if it feels right, do it. Egoism is more so, I'm just doing it because I want to, and if it feels good, do it. And then just to the right of that, still off the compass, we have anarcho-frontierism. This is the idea that true freedom should be sought after. However, because of the way society is structured and because of the fact that people will always want protected, true freedom and anarchy can only exist on the frontiers of human development. Or in other words, the only way to truly be free is to be a cowboy on the fringes of society out on your own. However, you may be thinking that may be fine and dandy back in the 1800s, but it's the 2000s and we've pretty much developed the whole world. But the anarcho-frontiersmen are one step ahead of you. See, the real frontiersmen believe that they can combine with transhumanism as a means of getting off Earth and being the first people to colonize another planet, therefore being on the fringes of society and achieving true anarchy and freedom. So in other words,
Christ.
anarchist space cowboy. Yeah! Which, anarchist space cowboy is the best term on this entire thing, and officially what I'm putting on the census from now on. And then finally, off the bottom right corner of the compass is abolitionism. So, you know how like the common complaint or criticism people have with anarchist societies or like anarchy in general is that people can do whatever they want and they'll just be violent all the time and people will just start killing each other. Well, abolitionism is saying yes, that's a good thing. It's the idea that people should be essentially in a Mad Max blood state sort of world because that will cultivate stronger people. And the way that anarcho-capitalism is businesses and markets can do whatever they want whenever they want. Abolitionism is you, the individual, can kill whoever you want. And you probably should, because if they couldn't stop you from doing it, they didn't deserve to live anyway. You could also view this as the maximum form of competitive markets. If markets were people and the competition was staying alive. It's like the downside of everything on the bottom of the compass, and it just loves it. The best way to describe abolitionism is how to speed run Darwinism. So yeah, that is it. That is the entirety of the political compass.
So yeah,
my word.
I went diagonally. I went from paleo-libertarianism to minarchism. Actually, I went from minarchism to paleo-libertarianism back to minarchism.
I'm going to change and we are going to wrap this baby up. Well, that was fun. For me at least. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I hope you didn't hate it. That'd be sad. There are some things that I noticed while researching and while recording the video that I picked up on that I want to mention now. So on similar sides of the compass itself, it's easy to draw parallels between the two. Like for example, authoritarian right and libertarian right Both were very big on ideas of individuality and things that make you as yourself special, or things that should be maintained special, like your own freedoms. Whereas on the left, ideas of community on the top and bottom were very strong. Down here, more voluntary, and up here, more insisted upon. And of course, the top two both felt the need to rule, while the bottom two felt the need to not be ruled. But there's a couple other weird things that I kind of noticed while talking about it. Like, for example, libertarian right and authoritarian left both really cared about power and money. Now, they cared about it in 100% opposite directions. Libertarian right thinking that you alone should have power and keep money, and authoritarian left thinking that everyone should either share the money or at least the state disperse it, and only a few people who are better than you should have power. But they both cared about it where things like nationalism or preserving nature weren't as focused upon between the two. And to add on to that, things like the authoritarian right really cared about social policies and national policies, and things like the libertarian left also cared about social and national policies. Now again, they cared about them in opposite directions, but they were still the prime driving factor. Whereas things like economy weren't as important between the two, at least whenever it comes to on the compass deciding where ideologies go. And I know the compass isn't perfect and it has a lot of problems, but it is a decent system for laying out a basic roadmap, or at least a starting point. And like I mentioned earlier, it's easy to draw comparisons between points on the compass that share similarities, like I mentioned with the rulerships with the authoritarian and libertarians, or things like community and individuality. However, it's a common belief that there is no way to connect the corners to each other, just because they believe completely opposite on everything, and there's no common ground that they can find. But what about this? Do you know what the libertarian left and the authoritarian right both had the exact same opinions on? Nature. While it wasn't the same across the entire board with every single idea, the general trend is that lib left wanted to preserve nature, and authoritarian right also wanted to preserve nature. While they disagree on nearly everything else, there was the commonality that the planet should be protected. Similarly, do you know what the authoritarian left and the libertarian right both agreed on? Technology. Even though you probably can't read that. While holding completely different ideas on everything else, the authoritarian left thought that technology was important and should be upgraded to be better in society, and the libertarian right thought technology is important and should be upgraded in order to achieve a better self. All four of these, despite having their exact opposites that they could theoretically never get along with in the real world, have common ground. I'm not qualified to say what that means or the implications of it. I'm just going to leave this here because I honestly have no idea what to do with this information now that I have it. Maybe horseshoe theory is real. Maybe politics are fake. Maybe this is all stupid. Who knows? There's one ideology I forgot to mention. I don't know how I forgot it. It's literally my ideology. I have no idea how I forgot to mention this. 1 second. And that is the idea of goonism, also known as Wendigoonism. It's pretty much the idea that anyone who has a following that they definitely don't deserve and they are more than grateful for should periodically thank the people of that following for the support that they've been shown, because again, it's very special to them, their support that they're getting, because it's something that they don't really deserve, at least not in an economic or time given sense. And people within Goonism are very grateful for the opportunity that they've been given and very thankful to those who have given them that opportunity. So I am going to practice good praxis by being a member of this ideology myself and say thank you for watching. This is again something that I haven't tried before, but you guys are so cool that I can just do what I want a lot of the time, and you're just there to show support and be.
Okay, so that's fun. I'm exhausted. Fucking hell, I'm really exhausted. I'm going to drink a bunch of NyQuil and go to sleep. I have been Mad Max of Maxwell Manor. I hope you enjoyed this. I'm sorry I didn't talk much, but like I said, I'm still recovering from the flu. I have plans for tomorrow. I don't know if they'll happen, but if they do, we will be streaming a new game. So, yeah, I will see you all next time.